Hey everybody, welcome back. This is part 4 of the Judaism Iceberg. Make sure to check out parts 1 through 3 if you haven't seen them yet. And without any further ado, let's get straight into it. Layer 22. The King's Crown Jewel. There's a pretty interesting analogy given in regards to Hasidus and the deeper Kabbalistic traditions of Torah. Basically, all of this, meaning the Hasidus and Kabbalistic teachings, weren't really taught to or learned by common, regular people. It was more just kept and learned between by the greatest sages in whatever time it was, just sort of learning it and not teaching it to the less holy and knowledgeable people who probably wouldn't understand it anyways. And that's kind of how it went since Mishnaic times, basically, until the late 1700s, when the Alter Rebbe wrote the Tanya, thereby making teachings of Hasidus and Kabbalah accessible to everybody. Some people weren't too thrilled about this. It was a whole argument that has ramifications actually to this very day. Now, the analogy given of the King's Crown Jewel is an example given in order to explain sort of the logic of the Alter Rebbe and his writing down of these super esoteric and holy works. The story goes that basically there was one time when some of the rabbis were walking along and they saw a sheet of paper with some of the holy Hasidic teachings lying crumpled on the floor, which was very upsetting, of course, and kind of the whole reason to begin with that this argument started, which was fear of things like this happening. So, the analogy is given of a king who had a son who was extremely ill, and basically he tried looking for physicians to cure his son, but none could succeed. Finally, one of the doctors said that there was a way to cure the son, but it would require to crush up the centermost jewel in the king's crown as a part of the cure. So, of course, the king decided to do this, which resulted in his son being cured. So too with Hasidus and Kabbalah, which is compared to God's crown jewel, with, in spite of the potential issues of making this knowledge available to literally everybody, it was worth it for all the good that it caused. Pas Yisrael and Chalav Yisrael. In addition to the general laws of kosher, there are some additional stringencies that some more religious groups take upon themselves, which are the rules of Pas Yisrael and Chalav Yisrael. Basically, there's a concern that if something is made in a factory, or basically just not under your direct supervision, that it's possible that someone could mistakenly make it not kosher somehow. Particularly, this is a concern with grain-based products and with milk. For instance, it used to be a bit of an issue that some farmers would mix milk from other animals to their cow milk in order just to meet quotas or something along those lines. So the stringency with milk, which is the Chalav Yisrael, it was watched by a certified rabbi during the actual milking process in order to assure that nothing not allowed went down unintentionally or otherwise. Similarly, there's also Pas Yisrael, which is the same concern with baking of grain-based products. So over there, the certified rabbi has to partake in the actual baking of the goods, which generally consists of him either turning on the oven or doing something similar just to be a part of the process in order to allow it to be kosher. There is an additional symbol on packaging for goods if it was made with these extra stringencies of kashrus, so that way people can know if they're allowed to purchase them or not, if they're particularly religious in this regard. The 10 Mivtzoim. The 10 Mivtzoim was essentially a 10-point campaign in order to spread awareness of Judaism towards Jewish people who are otherwise less religious across the world. It contains 10 things of particular focus in Judaism, which are particularly important for people to do if they don't do them yet. And these 10 things are to light Shabbos candles for women before Shabbos starts on Friday evening before sunset, tefillin for Jewish boys over the age of 13, mezuzah, that every Jewish house should have a mezuzah on its doorposts, Torah, to study portions of Torah every day, tzedakah, which means to give charity, having a house full of Jewish books, which means to have a somewhat sizable collection of Jewish holy books in your house, such as Chumash, a book which contains the Torah, books of Psalms, or prayer books, or things along those lines to study or learn or read from whenever. Kashrus, to keep the laws of kosher, to love your fellow, education, that every Jewish boy and girl should try to go to a Jewish school of some sort. And the last one, number 10, to observe the laws of family purity in regards to marriage. Maimonides, or the Rambam, which stands for his full name, Reb Moshe ben Maimon, lived in 12th century Egypt and was a renowned Talmudic and halachic scholar, physician, philosopher, and communal leader. In fact, he's fairly well known by both Jews and non-Jews, whether for his lengthy works as a physician and doctor or for his works as a Torah scholar. Probably his most famous work is the Mishnah Torah, which basically acts to condense the entirety of the Talmud into just the 613 commandments with extensive explanation and clarification of them. It's a very important and commonly studied work. In fact, as much earlier on the Iceberg, it's something which was instituted to study at least one chapter of it every single day. And in addition to this, he also wrote the Guide for the Perplexed, or the Mivtzoim in Hebrew, which is a foundational work on Jewish philosophy and seeks to reconcile the works of Aristotle in accordance to Jewish faith. Overall, he's a very important and prominent sage whose works kind of define a lot of what Judaism is today. Benching. So, a large amount of blessings said in regards to food are actually not biblically instituted. Among the few that are the after blessings, the blessings you say after you eat a meal or food in general. This is called benching in Yiddish, or birchas hamazon in Hebrew, and there's a separate version of the prayer depending on what you ate. For instance, there's a separate version if you ate a fruit or a vegetable or something containing grain, like a pastry or cereal or something along those lines. There's also an extra long prayer said after eating bread. It actually goes on for a few pages, but yeah, that's basically the idea. Generally, it's pretty important to thank God for your food that you just ate. Kiddush. Kiddush is a little ceremony done very frequently in Judaism. Basically, it consists of filling a cup up with wine or grape juice if that's your preference, but preferably wine, as it's associated with blessings in Judaism. Anyways, you fill the cup to the top. It's meant to be overflowing slightly to represent that our blessings should overflow. You say a blessing, of course, and then drink it. This ceremony is done every Friday night before Shabbos starts, before the meal, and also by the meal on the day of Shabbos. In fact, it's done by basically every single religious meal, be it 4 times by the Passover Seder, by every single Rosh Hashanah meal, every Sukkot meal, every Shavuos meal, by a bris milah, by a wedding. Yeah, it's very common. Chabad.org. Chabad.org is a website which is basically, at least my go-to Judaism website for basically everything. It has copies of most important and prominent Torah books or works in both English and Hebrew. They have weekly essays and teachings on the Torah portion. They have constantly updating times for the starts or ends of upcoming holidays or Shabbos. Basically, if you need anything in Judaism on the internet, Chabad.org is actually a really great website for any of that. In fact, a lot of the times when I need research for anything in this video, I use that as my primary source because I trust it a lot more than I do, say, Wikipedia. Kriyas Shema Alamita. So when you go to bed, there's an additional prayer said called Kriyas Shema Al Hamita. It's basically just the entire Shema with a bunch of additions, plus a smaller form of repentance, and you're meant to use this time to mentally go over your day, see what you did right, see what you did wrong, what you could improve and do better, that general idea. Also, when you finish the last paragraph of the prayer, you're not meant to eat or drink or anything else or even talk until the following morning. So yeah, you're meant to say it like right before you go to sleep. The 13 methods of derivation. The Talmud is basically a very long legal text with a few anecdotes, stories, and miscellaneous conversations stuck in randomly. Although, to be fair, throughout this entire iceberg, I've been kind of cherry-picking all the interesting stories and anecdotes, so that could give the impression that it's primarily full of those, but that's actually not the case. There's maybe like one story per every 30 pages or so. It's predominantly legal text and discussion of law. In regards to this law, the main thing it does is use traditions from the oral Torah, anecdotes of the actions of sages in the past, and verses of the written Torah to figure out whose of the many differing opinions on Torah law exactly is correct. In regards to verses from the written Torah, there are 13 traditional methods of derivation, which allow them to learn information from the text and the law from that. And these come up all throughout the Talmud. There are things such as, in Aramaic, a kal v'chomer, which is basically a fortiori argument in English. If you don't know what that is, it's essentially the argument that if one thing is permissible in a more extreme case, therefore in any lesser cases it would also be permissible. There's a gezerah shava, which essentially serves to link concepts in differing Torah verses based on usage of similar words or phrases. There's the concept of v'chein shnei chesuvim, which is that essentially if there are two verses in the Torah which contradict each other, then there is an explanation in a third verse which serves to reconcile the two, but in a different, separate third verse. Yeah, you get the general idea. Layer 23. 2 rabbis, 3 opinions. This one is sort of a popular phrase which is used kind of to poke fun at the Talmud in a sense, and the general fact that most of Jewish law, scripture, books, or otherwise basically just consists of rabbis arguing back and forth lengthily over minute details, hence the kind of joke or adage, I guess you'd call it, of 2 rabbis, 3 opinions, which just sort of serves to illustrate this fact. Passover 2. So there are actually 2 Passovers celebrated throughout the year. There's the first Passover, which commemorates the Jewish people's exodus from Egypt, and then, a while later, there's a second Passover called Pesach Sheni, or literally the second Passover in English. Basically, the reason it exists is because in the original Passovers, one of the main parts of it was the offering of the Passover sacrifice. However, there was a small subsect of people who weren't able to offer the sacrifice, and that was the people who were carrying Joseph's coffin out of Egypt, because they promised that he would be buried in Israel, and he was buried in Egypt. So when the Jewish people exited Egypt, they took Joseph's bones with him in a coffin, and the people who were carrying it were impure, and therefore unable to offer the paschal sacrifice. So they were pretty upset about this, and approached Moses, who, with the permission of God, allowed them to have a second time later on in the year to have a secondary opportunity to offer the Pesach sacrifice, and this is still celebrated in what's called Pesach Sheni, or the second Passover, which is a while after, where you just eat matzah, and the general idea is that it represents the concept of second chances and second opportunities and things along those lines. Name variations. This one refers to the fact that there are many names which have both English variants and Hebrew variants. Jewish names, of course, consisting of the Hebrew variants, and a pretty sizable amount of names are names derived from the Bible, but of course there is the English translation of the Bible, which has English versions of all the names, which is generally a less proper original way of pronouncing the name. So, for instance, there's Abraham in English, and then the Hebrew or Jewish name variation of that would be Avraham. Or Moses instead of Moshe, or Ezekiel instead of Yecheskel. In fact, there's basically a Jewish variant of just about every single name, and most people, when they become religious, if they're Jewish, start using the Jewish variant of their name instead of their English original one. Rabbi Akiva and the Bandits. There is yet another famous story about Rabbi Akiva. This time was that he was traveling alone with nothing but his donkey and a rooster, a candle, and a few books. At some point during his journey, he came across a town and asked if he could spend the night there, but everybody said no. So he decided to just camp out nearby the village. That night, he was sitting there alone with his donkey, rooster, and candle, and also his books, I guess, which he was probably learning via the light of his candle, when all of a sudden a gust of wind blew out his candle, which was pretty upsetting to him, but he decided that it was probably for the best somehow. And then he sat there a while longer, when suddenly a wild cat of some kind came and ate his rooster, which was also upsetting, but he decided that it also must have been for the best. And then he sat there for a while longer, when all of a sudden, a lion came and ate his donkey, which also wasn't great, but he decided that it must be for the best. So then he went to sleep without his donkey or his rooster or his candle, and then he woke up the next morning. He saw that the town he had wanted to stay in had been raided by bandits that night, and everyone had either been killed or enslaved, and he had been spared because he hadn't entered the town. And also, the bandits hadn't been able to see him or hear him because he didn't have a candle or his rooster or his donkey to make noise. And this is a very famous story brought, which just further illustrates the concepts of how everything God does is for the best, even if we don't immediately see it that way. How to be Jewish. So Judaism functions a little bit differently than other religions in the sense that it's also an ethnicity, but also the religion functions in a similar way, which is that you don't become Jewish by acting religious. Judaism doesn't have to do with your level of religion or practice of Judaism. The way Judaism works is that if your mother is Jewish, then you're Jewish, and that's about it. Or if you converted, of course, or if your mother converted. If just your mother is Jewish, then you're 100% Jewish. And if just your father is Jewish, then you're not Jewish. And it really doesn't matter on your level of practice or otherwise. Jews died during the 10 plagues. So the 10 plagues in Egypt are a pretty famous part of the Torah. There were 10 plagues, which God smited the Egyptians with after they refused to let the Jewish people go after enslaving them for a pretty lengthy period of time. However, it's brought by the commentaries that also a pretty sizable portion of the Jewish people died also during the 10 plagues, particularly during the plague of darkness. And this consisted of all the Israelites who wanted to stay in Egypt for whatever reason and not leave Egypt to go to Israel and receive the Torah. So, during the Plague of Darkness, all these people died, and it was specifically during the Plague of Darkness, so that way the Egyptians wouldn't see the Israelites dying also, and start getting any differing ideas as to how the 10 plagues worked. The priestly garments. There were 4 garments worn by the Kohanim, as they were called, in the temple, and 8 garments worn by the Kohen Gadol in the temple, the high priest. Specifically, the ordinary Kohanim would wear the katonas, which was a long linen tunic that reached until the heels, the avnit, which was a long sash made of linen and red, purple, and blue wool, the mikba'as, which was a linen turban hat, and the michnasayim, which were basically pants. The Kohen Gadol, the high priest, wore these 4 also, but in addition they wore the choshen, the breastplate, which had the 12 stones, each representing one of the 12 tribes of Israel, the ephod, which was a backwards apron of sorts and made out of more fancy wool and also spun gold, the me'il, which was another robe, but this time decorated with little bells and pomegranates of sorts on the hem. And lastly, the tzitz, which was a little golden plate with the words "Holy to God" inscribed on its surface and attached to the high priest's turban, which was shaped a little differently than the other Kohanim. Simchas Torah. Simchas Torah is a holiday which is celebrated at the very end of the first month of the Jewish calendar, right after the holidays of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. It celebrates the finishing of the Torah, since a portion of the Torah is read every single week in synagogue. Eventually, at this point in the year, you finish the Torah, and then you immediately start anew, going from the passing of Moses straight back to the beginning with the creation of the world. It's a very joyous holiday with most of the customs, including singing and dancing and things along those lines. Layer 24. Meiser. Meiser is one of the laws in Judaism in regards to charity, and it's pretty short. It basically just states that any amount of money you ever make at all, 10% of it is given to charity. Meiser meaning, of course, 10%. So anytime you receive a paycheck or a gift or find money on the floor or anything along those lines, 10% of it immediately should go to charity. The redemption of the firstborn. Originally, before the descendants of the tribe of Levi became the priests to serve in the temple, it was designated that every firstborn would serve in the temple instead. However, since the firstborns participated in the sin of the golden calf, instead, the right of the priestship went to the tribe of Levi instead, who didn't participate in the sin of the golden calf. Therefore, there is a custom that whenever a firstborn is born, he needs to redeem himself from the Kohanim, which basically consists of giving a Kohen about 5 silver coins 30 days after a Jewish male firstborn is born. The 3 pillars of the world. There's a very famous quote from the Torah book Perkei Avos, which means Ethics of Our Fathers, by the sage Shimon HaTzadik, which states that the world stands on 3 things: Torah, service of God, and acts of human kindness. Torah, of course, referring to learning Torah. Service generally means in reference to prayer, and acts of human kindness just, means being good to one another. Shliach mitzvah gelt. Okay, this one's a little bit complicated. Basically, there's a very famous quote from the Talmud, which states in regards to a story that somebody who's on the path to do a mitzvah or a good deed or something like that, no harm could befall him. Although it does amend that slightly by saying that it's only if he's not in a situation of particularly extreme danger. So it's established that there's this general rule, which is that if you're on your way to do a good deed or a mitzvah, no harm could befall you. So there's a bit of an interesting custom, which is that if someone's going to go on a long trip, which it might be perceived as dangerous, for instance, they're going on an airplane and some people just want to feel a bit safe. So what they'll do is they'll go over to somebody and that person will give them a coin or two to specifically give to charity in the country or state or wherever they're flying to. So that way, as they're flying, they're actively on the way to do a good deed because they're taking that guy's coin across the country to put in a charity box or something like that. And that way, during that moment, they're technically on their way to do a good deed and therefore no harm could befall them. Kind of feels like cheating, but whatever makes people feel safe. The 4 categories of things. So in the Tanya and in a few Kabbalistic sources, there are basically 4 categories of things, which everything in the world is sorted into, which are inanimate objects, plants, animals, and people. And it states that the amount of godly energy going into each one of them is incomparably greater than the previous. And it's a whole discussion, and it goes on at length, which is not too relevant right now, but it is worth note that there are 4 categories of things in general, according to Kabbalah. Ancient Aramaic. The Talmud and the Mishnah and a lot of works in those earlier centuries are written not in Hebrew, actually, but in a different language, Ancient Aramaic, which was the language spoken in that area of Babylonia and the surrounding regions. It's something of a dead language nowadays. In fact, it's not even really spoken by Jewish people, even though it's the language that the entire Talmud is written in, just because it's not relevant in any way besides for those texts, and also it doesn't have any religious significance like Hebrew does, so it's not exceptionally relevant to be able to speak, but people can translate it to an extent. There are some modern languages which are derived somewhat from this language, most of which are spoken in the Middle East area of the world and possibly Persia, but besides for that, it's not too relevant anymore. Also, the version used in the Talmud and Mishnah has Hebrew lettering, which varies slightly from other versions of it back in the 1st century. The salamander. There's a strange creature, which is mentioned a few times in the Talmud, amongst many, actually, fantastical and strange creatures that are brought up in the Talmud. This time that of the salamander, which apparently is a lizard-like creature of some sort, which is comprised of fire, and in fact born of fire, and is made by leaving on an oven for a really, really long period of time. It's questionable how literal this is meant to be, or if it's just a legend, or just some folk tales that were told in that area. But yeah, salamanders are a thing that are mentioned occasionally throughout the Talmud. Similarly, there are also mermaids, which this one's a bit more reasonable, because a few times it makes some vague reference to a creature of sorts that lives in the ocean, which has animal, fish-like characteristics, but also human attributes, and apparently it caused issues for sailors in the area, and it basically just describes essentially a mermaid, which is, a half-fish, half-person creature, and all this sounds kind of strange. However, the Aramaic word in the Talmud for this creature is delphinon, which sounds a lot like dolphin, so it's probably just referring to a dolphin with a bit of, legend mixed into it. Nadav and Avihu. Aaron, the high priest, who was Moses' brother and also served in the temple, had two sons named Nadav and Avihu. One time, they both got really drunk in the Torah and decided that it would be a good idea to bring an offering to God in this state. So they went into the temple while intoxicated, tried to bring an offering before God, and then a fire came out and incinerated them from the inside, leaving their outsides intact, but their insides incinerated. It's explained that this represents sort of the dichotomy of the soul and the body, how the body has a desire to remain in this physical world, and the soul wants to leave this physical world and body and return to God. However, obviously the soul has a purpose in this world, so therefore it can't leave. But in the case of these two people, Nadav and Avihu, their yearning to connect to God was so great that their souls actually left their bodies, hence it really wasn't such a bad thing what happened, besides for the fact that they were, intoxicated in the temple, which isn't really allowed, and also the fact that that's not the purpose of this world, which is to have your soul leave it and reconnect to God. The purpose of this world is to make this world a better place while being in this world. So that's sort of the main thing that's learnt out from this entire topic. Layer 25. The Kohen's challah portion. Challah are the braided loaves of bread which are traditionally served at the Shabbos meals or most holiday meals. Back in the times of the temple, there was a mandatory tithe of a portion of your dough whenever you made this that was given to the Kohanim in the temple. Nowadays, there is no temple to donate your bread to, so instead what happens is that every time you bake a loaf of challah beforehand, you take a portion of the dough and you put it in the oven and you burn it, which is temporarily done in place of giving it to the Kohen, although apparently the custom will be reinstated once Mashiach comes and the temple is rebuilt. Incense. Some offerings in the temple required the burning of a certain mixture of herbs and spices, which was called ketairos, or incense in English. They were actually one of the few sacrifices that were offered on the golden inner altar that was inside of the actual temple, as opposed to the much larger one where most animal sacrifices were done. The most famous offering of the ketairos was probably the one that was done as part of the Yom Kippur offering by the high priest. The exact mixture of spices is written down in the Talmud and in portions of the Torah, and it's a mixture of balsam oil, onycha, storax, frankincense, musk, cassia, spikenard, saffron, costus, cinnamon, and agarwood. Also, interestingly, the Avitnus family, which was the family that was in charge of making and manufacturing the incense mixture, added an additional special herb which was only called mile ashan, which translates to that which makes smoke rise, because apparently this herb would make the smoke rise in a pillar straight up as opposed to spreading out. But we have no idea what this herb is nowadays. The three major festivals. This refers to the fact that there are many holidays in Judaism. There's Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Purim, Hanukkah, but a lot of those are actually rabbinically instituted, mostly Hanukkah, Purim, Tu B'Shvat, and some of the others. The three main, most prominent festivals in Judaism, which are the three major festivals, are Passover, Sukkot, and Shavuos, as these are the three ones which are biblically instituted. In fact, these were the three festivals wherein it was required for people to make a pilgrimage to the temple whenever this festival came around, back when, of course, the temple still stood. Nowadays, these are some of the only festivals which have special additions in prayer and are also treated with most of the same laws as Shabbos due to their particular significance. The Sapphire Commandments. Most people, when they imagine the Ten Commandments, imagine them engraved on stone. But according to some of the commentaries in the Torah, that's actually not true. Instead, they say that the Ten Commandments were engraved out of sapphire, the sapphire coming from God's throne. Whether or not this is literal, I doubt it, because I don't know that precisely God has a big throne that he sits on. But I guess the only way to check if the Ten Commandments were made of sapphire would be to track down the Aron, and I don't think anyone's doing that anytime soon, so until then. Pomegranates. Pomegranates are actually somewhat significant in Judaism. On top of them being one of the special 7 fruits of Israel, they're actually a special fruit designated to be eaten as a custom on the holiday of Rosh Hashanah. as the tradition goes that we eat them to express how we wish for our year to be filled with as many merits as a pomegranate has seeds. In addition, there's also an old tradition which says that pomegranates have 613 seeds exactly, representing the 613 commandments, although I've personally never counted. The seven fruits of Israel. In the Torah, when it's describing the extraordinary beauty and uniqueness of the land of Israel, it describes it as having a lot of great attributes, including listing 7 specific fruits, which are wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates. So these 7 fruits actually have a special after blessing, and there's just general significance lent to these 7. Also, there's some Kabbalistic explanations which explain that each of these 7 fruits represents some of God's divine attributes of the 10 spheres, being kindness, severity, harmony, perseverance, humility, foundation, and royalty, correlating with each of those 7 fruits. So yeah, these 7 fruits are generally pretty significant in Judaism. Birthday customs. There are lots of specific traditions and customs that are meant to be done on your birthday, although beforehand it is worth note that the Hebrew calendar operates slightly differently than the English calendar, so all of this would apply on your Hebrew birthday, which is the one that Jewish people traditionally hold according to. But some of the important customs are to give charity, to spend some extra time praying, to say as many psalms, Tehillim, as possible, to say the psalm number correlating with your birthday, for instance, the 25th one if it's your 24th birthday, to learn some extra Torah, to partake of a new fruit and say the Shehechianu blessing, which is said whenever you eat a new fruit. And if you're a boy over the age of 13, then the prior Shabbos you should get called up by the reading of the Torah. Ethics of our fathers. Perkei Avos, or Ethics of Our Fathers, is a very important book in Jewish culture and tradition. It basically lists the passing down of the tradition of the Oral Torah from Moses to Joshua to the elders down every single rabbi until about the 1st or 2nd century, featuring rabbis like Rabbi Akiva, Hillel, and Shammai, Shimon HaTzadik, Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, Shimon ben Shattach, and just a bunch of generally very prominent and important sages in Judaism. Alongside that, every time one of the sages is mentioned, it lists a bunch of their famous quotes and advice that they would give. So it's essentially just a giant collection of sayings regarding ethics, honesty, and just general advice on how to live your life. Korach's rebellion. There's a pretty important part of the Torah wherein, as the Jewish people were traveling through the desert, one of the leaders of the Levites and a cousin of Moses and Aaron, a guy by the name of Korach, got kind of jealous of Moses and Aaron, and due to his ego decided to try to have a rebellion against the two of them. So it generally caused a pretty significant issue, and a large amount of Jews actually sided with Korach and his forces. And just when things were getting pretty bad, God opened up the earth into a giant hole, and Korach and all of his followers fell into it. And also the next day, a fire from heaven killed 250 other people who were causing problems with Aaron and his priestship. The Levites weren't enslaved. As implied by the Torah and explained by commentaries, during the whole time that the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, this included all of the Jewish people, besides for the tribe of Levi. This is mostly based on the point that Moshe and his brother Aaron were able to basically just do whatever they wanted, go where they pleased, that kind of thing, and they were of the tribe of Levi. And it seems like most people of the tribe of Levi could kind of do whatever they wanted. This is attributed to a few reasons. Some say that the Levites were never marked down on the whole slavery list to begin with, because the way that it worked out was that the Israelites were kind of tricked into slavery in a way, through all signing up for work forms, which were supposed to be voluntary and paid, but when they showed up, they were all enslaved. But the Levites never showed up to begin with because they were always too occupied with their learning. And there's also the whole thing about Pharaoh not wanting to enslave them because they were always the spiritual leaders of the Jewish people, and he didn't want to get into too much trouble or something like that. Main point is that according to some commentaries, the Levites weren't enslaved, unlike everybody else. Layer 26. Moses had a stutter. It's a little known fact that Moses actually had a pretty severe stutter, which was one of his main complaints when he was initially asked by God by the burning bush to convince the Pharaoh to let the Israelites go, and he ended up having to use his brother as his spokesman for him. The reason for this was that when he was a child and living in the Pharaoh's house, as he had been adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter, there was a time when the Pharaoh became suspicious of him when he was very young and decided to test him. So he brought before him 2 plates, one of which contained shiny, glowing coals, and the other which had dull, unburnished gold. His logic being that if Moses was not smart and a cause for concern, he would go for the non-shiny, boring, dull pieces of gold, but if he was an ordinary child, he would go for the shinier object, which would be the glowing hot coals. Unfortunately, Moses decided to immediately reach for the gold. However, an angel who was watching over Moses decided to knock his hand away from the gold, and it hit the coals, causing him to accidentally pick it up and somehow put it in his mouth, which burnt his mouth severely and caused him to have a severe stutter for the rest of his life. The snake in the wall. There's a famous story, once again, in the Talmud, which relates the importance of giving charity to the poor, this time not involving Rabbi Akiva, but involving Rabbi Akiva's daughter, about whom there was a prophecy told to Rabbi Akiva that she would die on the night of her wedding. So Rabbi Akiva was pretty nervous about this, but eventually his daughter got married, and on the night of her wedding, she went to her private room, took out one of the pins in her hair, and stuck it into the wall for safekeeping. The next day, Rabbi Akiva went to check up on her daughter and saw that she was still alive, which she was, so he was pretty happy about that. But when she went to retrieve her hairpin, she pulled it out and noticed that there was something stuck to the other end inside of the wall. So they checked, and there was a giant venomous snake inside of her wall that she had killed by stabbing it through the head with a pin, saving her life, apparently. And when Rabbi Akiva asked her what she had done to merit having her life saved, she mentioned that during her wedding, she noticed there was a poor person hanging around, and she had privately approached him and given him some food to eat. So yeah, that's kind of the whole point of this story, which is that giving charity is very important and can possibly save your life. The quest for the breastplate stone. The breastplate was one of the special articles of clothing worn by the Kohen Gadol, which had 12 extremely rare, precious stones, each of which represented one of the 12 tribes. Anyways, one of these stones went missing or broke or something like that, so the rabbis went around asking to see if anybody had a replacement that they could purchase. So there was this one guy named Dama ben Nisina, who was a non-Jew who lived in Ashkelon, who apparently owned one. So they tracked him down and came to his house and asked him if they could purchase it at the price of 600,000 gold coins. However, the stone was kept in a locked chest, and the key of the chest was resting under the head of Dhamma's father, who was asleep. And Dhamma was so respectful of his father that he refused to wake him up and actually lost out on the sale because of this. So, because of this, God rewarded him with having a red-haired cow born in his flock, which was exceedingly rare and used by the Jewish people in the time of the Holy Temple as part of the purification ceremony. And it was purchased by the rabbis for the same amount that they had offered for the stone. This story just generally further illustrates the importance of honoring your mother and father. The Sambation River. There's a strange and mysterious river referenced in the Talmud, which is called the Sambation. Reportedly, it's a very dangerous river that's impossible to cross, which throws up stones and dirt in a constant tirade, but apparently it does this only 6 days a week, and on Shabbos it rests. This river is one of the suggested options as to the location of the missing 10 tribes of Israel. The sea split 12 times. In regards to the splitting of the Red Sea by Moses as the Jewish people left Israel, it's most oftenly portrayed as the sea splitting in half, but there's actually commentaries which state that that's not what happened. It actually split into 12 sections, one section for each of the 12 tribes, the 4 groups by the sea. Also, in regards to the splitting of the Red Sea, it says that as the Jewish people first reached the sea, before the sea had split and the Egyptians were rapidly pursuing them, everybody kind of freaked out and split into 4 groups, each of which was arguing with the other. One group said that there was nothing that they could do, they were stuck, and that they should all just throw themselves into the sea. The second group decided that they should just return to Egypt as slaves. The third group said that they should wage war against the Egyptians, and the fourth group said, let's pray to God. As it turns out, all 4 groups were incorrect, as they had been told by God to continue into the sea, and none of them were doing that, they were just arguing. At least until this one guy, by the name of Nachshon ben Aminadab, actually just straight up walked into the ocean, and at the point where he almost drowned, that's when the sea split. This whole story kind of illustrates basically the idea that when God tells you to do something, that's not a time to pray or argue or try to figure out your own conclusions. It's just the time to do that thing, and that's it. Achitophel the betrayer. Achitophel was one of King David's top generals and was a pretty good guy for the time being and actually learnt with King David pretty often. However, when King David's son Avshalom decided to have a rebellion against his father, Achitophel decided to defect and betray King David and turn to the side of Avshalom, King David's son. So when King David prayed to God, he specifically mentioned that Avshalom shouldn't listen to Achitophel's advice because if he did, he knew that they would win. And Avshalom, being very haughty and egotistical, decided to not listen to Avshalom's advice, at which point Avshalom realized that they were definitely going to lose the incoming battles, went home, gave some advice to his kids, put his affairs in order, and then killed himself. So he's not looked on too fondly for his actions, especially since he decided to betray King David, but besides for that, he's a very interesting character. No 3-year-old trees. There's a pretty interesting rule in the Torah as one of the 613 commandments called Arla, which basically states that you can't harvest or eat any fruit from a tree that's not yet 3 years old. This is based off of a verse in the Torah where it says that you can't eat any fruit for the first 3 years of the tree's life. But yeah, that's basically it. I just thought it was pretty interesting. Layer 27. Upshurnish. An upshurnish is a ceremony done for Jewish boys at the age of 3 years old. What it celebrates is that, similar to a tree, a Jewish boy's hair is not cut for the first 3 years of his life, until finally his upshurnish, which is a ceremony where for the first time he receives a haircut. It's also the time where Jewish boys begin wearing a kippah and tzitzis, which they'll go on to do for the rest of their lives. The general idea of this whole ceremony is that it's the age of the beginning of the boy's education of Torah and Jewish law, which is why it's the custom for the boy during this whole thing to read the Aleph Beis, which are just the ABCs of the Hebrew language. Manna. The manna, or the mun in Hebrew, was the food which miraculously fell from the sky during the 40 years that the Jewish people traveled through the desert before they reached the land of Israel. It had several miraculous properties, such as that apparently it tasted like whatever you wanted it to taste like. The amount that was needed by you and your family was the exact amount that fell, along with a double portion on Fridays for the Shabbos. And if you took more than what you needed, then the portion that you took would rot and go bad. Apparently, it was the size of a coriander seed and the color of a specific type of fine crystal, which was white. Before the mun fell, a north wind would blow, sweeping the ground, and then the rain would wash it. Then a layer of dew would fall, at which point then the mun fell, at which point another layer of dew would fall on top of it in order to keep it clean and sanitary. Also, it didn't need to be digested as it was so holy. All of this sounds pretty cool, but the Israelites didn't think so because they decided to complain about the texture and other stuff, which would then cause a bunch of issues for them. It's also said that a jar of this mun was kept and hidden inside of the Aron, which at this point we don't really know where it is. Sneezing killed people. So according to some traditions, back in biblical times, before the times of Moses, by the times of the forefathers and before, whenever somebody would pass away, they would sneeze and then immediately die. And that's kind of how it went until the time of Yaakov, who prayed to God in the Torah that he should be given time to bless his sons and speak to them before his passing, which is why he was sick before he passed away and was the first person to ever have an illness before his passing. as opposed to just sneezing and dying. Apparently, this is the source for one of the reasons why traditionally people say bless you or things along those lines whenever somebody sneezes, because it used to be that when you sneezed, you would die. So it was pretty cool now that when you sneezed, you didn't die. Overpopulation by the resurrection. There's a question brought up in the Talmud, which is that by the resurrection of the dead, which is one of the most significant points by the coming of the Mashiach, that will be a lot of resurrected people, nearly like 100 billion of them by the last count. And the question is that how will there be enough room in the world, as there's probably not going to be enough room across the entire world for every single person to live all at once. So the answer is actually pretty simple. It's just that if God could resurrect the dead, then he'd probably be able to make room for everybody also. Mount Sinai's location. So nowadays, we're not fully sure where Mount Sinai is. There is a few suggestions, the most main one being a big mountain that's in the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. But I don't know that that's necessarily the case, because it's mentioned in the Talmud where a bunch of rabbis decide to go through the desert and find the mountain, that it's surrounded by a constant watching ring of white scorpions. So if anybody finds those, then they'll probably know that that's the right mountain. Abracadabra. Abracadabra is a word which is generally used in regards to magic tricks and things like that, but it might actually have Hebrew origins. This is because the words abracadabra sound very similar to the Hebrew words abara kadabara, I create like I speak, which sounds very similar to some of the general magic-related notions in the words abracadabra, and also sounds similar to the words abracadabra. So it's possibly associated with like old black magic and mysticism and things like that, but I'm not 100% sure. Olives and eggs. The Talmud is a very detailed legal text, so of course it needs to talk extensively about measurements. However, this was before the invention of modern measurements, whether you use the metric system or whatever else there is. So it uses a lot of interesting, strange reference for measurements. For instance, for length and width, it uses measurements known as amos and tfachim, or an amma and a tefach, which are roughly an arm's length and a fist's length, respectively, which is about 1.5 feet for an amma and maybe a few inches for the tefach. And there's also specific measurements for volumes of liquid, but the measurements for volumes in general, and are the terminologies used in basically all Jewish legal texts, are the size of an olive or the size of an egg. And those are the respective measurements used, calculations of mass and volume. The 8 forms of charity. So, as listed by Maimonides, there are 8 levels of charity, each greater than the previous. The highest possible level is to give somebody a job. The next lower level is to give somebody money without you or them knowing who the money was given to or received from, so that nobody should be embarrassed. The next level is where you know who you're giving it to, but the person receiving it doesn't know who he's receiving it from. The level after that is where you don't know who you're giving it to, but the person receiving it knows who he's receiving it from. The next level is where you give it to somebody directly by hand before you're asked. The next level is where you give inadequately, but happily and with a smile to make him feel good. And the 8th and lowest level of charity is when you give unwillingly. Smicha. Smicha refers to the process by which somebody is named a rabbi by another group of rabbis. It used to be done in an unbroken chain from Moses to his student Joshua and down, but that whole thing ended by the times of the Roman destruction of Jerusalem and the Bar Kokhba revolt, when a lot of rabbis and Jewish people got killed. So nowadays, smicha is a certification that's given to rabbis who take a very lengthy test after studying for years in the yeshiva, which basically covers some of the more complicated laws of kosher and Shabbos and things along those lines. Although it is worth note that some people get their rabbinical status through less legitimate means than that, but generally speaking, in Judaism, the way that somebody actually officially has the terminology rabbi applied to them is by taking this smicha test and being certified by other rabbis. Mashiach's name. So obviously we don't really know who Mashiach is, besides for that he's a person who will be the king of the Jewish people during the time of the Mashiach and rebuild the third temple. But the Talmud does give a list of potential names for him, based on the meaning of the names and their significance. Some of the options of names offered are Shila, Yinoin, Chanina, and Menachem, which are all pretty common Jewish names. Layer 28. The inheritance of prophecy. There's a bit of an odd point mentioned very briefly in the Talmud in regards to the nature of prophecy. Essentially, prophets used to be a thing, the more prominent ones being well-known guys like Eliyahu, Elisha, Devorah, those kinds of people. And it says that they would receive prophecy in dreams of allegory or visions or stuff along those lines. In fact, the only prophet to ever communicate fully and properly with God through speaking was Moshe, due to his super high level. But then it says nowadays, after the destruction of the temple and the time of prophets ended, that the gift of prophecy was given over to children and the insane. I'm not really sure how to tell the difference between their normal ramblings and what's a prophecy, but that's the general idea. The stages of life. A sage by the name of Yehuda ben Tema is quoted in the book of Perkei Avos, Ethics of Our Fathers, which was explained a few lines earlier on this chart, as describing what a person should have accomplished by each major milestone age in his life. It says that at 5 years of age, he should be able to study the Chumash, which is the Torah. At 10, the study of the Mishnah. At 13, the study of the Commandments. At 15, the Talmud. At 18, he should be married. At 20, he should have a source of livelihood. At 30 is the peak of his strength. At 40, of his wisdom. At 50 is when he's able to give counsel. At 60 is when he's officially reached the status of old age. At 70, he's reached the fullness of his years. At 80, the age of strength of wisdom. At 90, he's stooped over. And at 100, he's basically dead. The 10 trials of Abraham. Famously, Abraham was given 10 tests by God, as listed by Maimonides. They were, the first one being to leave his home and move to the land of Canaan. The second was that immediately after he moved there was a famine. The third was that the Egyptians seized his wife, Sarah, and brought her to Pharaoh, which caused a whole issue. The fourth was when Abraham had to deal with the whole issue of a war between the 4 and the 5 kings. The fifth was that he was unable to have children with his wife Sarah and had to marry a second wife, Hagar. The sixth was that God told him to circumcise himself at a really old age. The seventh was that the king of Gerar captured Sarah again and also caused a bunch of issues. The eighth was that God told him to send Hagar away after having a child. The ninth was that he had a bunch of issues with his son, Ishmael. And the 10th, final one, was that he was told to bring his son as a sacrifice to God by the binding of Isaac. Some lists have this slightly altered, say with having one of them swapped out with the fact that he was thrown into a giant fiery furnace by the king Nimrod when he was younger, but that's the general idea. The 10 miracles of the temple. Also, according to the book Perkei Avos, there were 10 miracles brought in the temple. The first one was that no woman miscarried because of the smell of all the dead animals lying everywhere. The second, that no meat ever went bad. The third, that there was never any flies. The fourth, that no high priest ever mistakenly became impure on the day of Yom Kippur. The fifth, that the rains never extinguished the fire on the wood piles. The sixth, that the wind wasn't able to blow the giant column of smoke to the side. It only ever went up in a straight pillar. The eighth was that there was a lot of people crammed into the temple at once, but people somehow always had room to bow down whenever that time in prayer came up. The ninth was that a snake and a scorpion never hurt anyone in Jerusalem during this time. And the 10th and final was that no person ever wasn't able to find lodging in Jerusalem. The characteristics of the fool. There are 7 characteristics given to a fool and 7 to a wise man. In regard to a wise person, it says that he doesn't interrupt somebody else, he doesn't answer too quickly, he asks what's relevant and answers what's to the point, he answers the first question first and the last question last. If he doesn't know something, he just says, I don't know, and he acknowledges the truth. And the opposite of all these are the characteristics of a fool. a sponge, a funnel. It said that there are 4 types of people who sit before a sage: a sponge, a funnel, a strainer, and a sieve. A sponge soaks up everything. A funnel takes in at one end and lets everything out on the other. A strainer lets out the wine and retains the bad parts. And a sieve, which keeps the good parts and lets out the bad parts. Which, of course, is used to explain the 4 types of people who learn information. Somebody who just takes everything in, somebody who takes absolutely nothing in, somebody who retain all the bad parts somehow and retains none of the good information, and somebody who retains all the good important information and disregards all the bad useless information. The raven and the dove. By the whole incident of Noah's Ark, after God flooded the world, Noah was trying to figure out if there was any dry land, so he let out some of the birds in his ark, first releasing a raven, and then later on releasing a dove, which was able to find dry land. However, it's explained in the commentaries that the raven actually got into a whole argument with Noah, because ravens are generally not associated with the best things in Judaism. They represent selfishness and are associated with klipa and impurity, as opposed to the dove, which is of course associated with purity and goodness and righteousness. So the raven naturally caused a bunch of issues and was unable to find dry land, and the dove actually looked around for a period and managed to find an olive branch sticking out of the waters, brought it back to Noah, and they realized that the waters were settling at that point. Emulating the 4 animals. There's a very important concept in Judaism, which is that a person should strive to emulate 4 animals, that he should be as strong as a leopard, as swift as an eagle, as fleet as a gazelle, and as brave as a lion, in order to serve God and do the right things. Each of which is particularly relevant in its own aspect, but it's obvious why all 4 of these are of particular importance. And with that, that's the end of part 4 of the Judaism Iceberg. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video and learned something new. And with that said, have a great night.